Boldwood presents His Other Woman, written by Valerie Keogh and read by Rose Robinson. Chapter 1. Lydia. It was still dark when I opened my eyes, so I wasn't sure how long I'd been unconscious. My cheek was pressed into the thick pile of the carpet, and my head felt like it had been cracked open. I tried to sit up, but the pain was excruciating, making me cry out and give up the attempt. Without moving, I could see where Rich lay on the floor a few feet away. He was looking in my direction, his arm extended, his hand close enough that I was able to reach for it. I wrapped my fingers around his and squeezed gently. "Rich, you okay?" He didn't answer, nor did his fingers return the pressure on my hand. Worst of all, what made my eyes fill and a lump appear in my throat so that I swallowed convulsively. He didn't blink. I was a crime fiction fan. TV or books, it didn't matter. I devoured them all. I particularly liked true crime documentaries with their detailed explanation of the misdeed and the hunt for the perpetrator. Like a sponge, I'd absorbed knowledge all along the way. So even in my shock, with my face still pressed to the floor and pain radiating from the back of my skull to blur my vision, I knew why he wasn't blinking. I recognized the nauseating stink that curled into my nostrils for what it was. Rich was dead. There was something else. It was hovering at the back of my mind, something important I was supposed to do. Something... But whatever it was, it kept bouncing out of my grasp. Gritting my teeth, I raised myself enough to look around the spacious hotel room. I'd spent hours on the website assessing the various options before choosing it. It was the wrong time to wish I'd made a different choice, that I'd chosen a compact room instead, one where a shout might be heard in the room next door or in the corridor outside. One where the phone wasn't taunting me from the console on the far side of the room. A tentative effort to get to my feet, even to sit, failed. The pain made my head swim, my vision blurring even further. Raising a hand, I felt a warm, wet mass tangling my hair. It explained the pain, the confusion, and my inability to remember what it was I was supposed to do, because I was suddenly certain there had been something. But whatever it was lost in my injuries. I was hurt, but I was alive. A grim determination to ensure I stayed that way made me inch forward towards the phone. Every movement sent my head swimming. I pushed Rich's arm out of the way and shuffled a few inches forward. As I came level with him, I stopped, ignored the pain, and rose on my forearms to gaze into his face. Perhaps I'd been wrong. Perhaps it was the air conditioning that had made his body stiff and cold. "Rich?" I rested a hand against his cheek. "Rich!" I slapped him, gently at first, then harder, the sound of flesh on flesh loud in the quiet. Tears blurred my vision even more. I collapsed onto his shoulder and pressed my face into the curve of his neck. It would have been nice to think of happier times when I'd done the same, of days lying on the beach or in the fields after a picnic. But my imagination had never been that good. I'd always been the prosaic type, the doer and organizer, the facts person, not the dreamer. Rich was dead. I was hurt. How badly, I wasn't sure. Perhaps I could simply stay there resting on him until housekeeping came in to service the room mid-morning. They'd get me help then. My eyes closed and I felt myself drift away. Head injuries could be fatal. I didn't need a vivid imagination to picture housekeeping turning up to find our dead bodies. But I'd gone through too much to give up now. Had worked way too hard to lose everything at this stage. The thought galvanized me. The quickest way across to the phone was blocked by Rich. In death, as in life, he was a big man. 6'2" of solid muscle, impossible to move. I rose onto my elbows, ignoring the instant dart of pain, and looked down at his face. A strong face, handsome in a rugged, masculine way. There was always a twinkle in his eye, as if he was secretly laughing at you. I found it incredibly sexy. Until, somewhere in the last few years, and I'm not sure when, that twinkle seemed to have died. Instead, when he looked at me, there had been something else lurking in his eyes. A certain hardness, almost a resignation that this was it. He was stuck with me. And somewhere in those same years, I seemed to have given up and become just the kind of woman I'd never wanted to be. Pathetic, drab, and boring. It was a bad time and way too late to have regrets, but I had them all the same. If only we'd sat down and talked when we'd first started to fall apart, perhaps we wouldn't have done. I rested my hand against Rich's face. Perhaps if he'd told me everything when we'd first met, things would be different. But he hadn't, so they weren't. He was dead. I might be dying. The phone was tantalizingly close, but so far away. If I could have stood, I'd have stepped over Rich's body, but even propping myself on an elbow was taking its toll. When black dots shimmered across my vision, I knew I was going to faint. I lowered myself to the carpet, but it took several seconds for the sensation to fade. I couldn't stand to step over my dead husband, and even if his body didn't look like an insurmountable mountain, I couldn't have brought myself to crawl over him. Instead, I began to make my way around him, inch by agonizing inch. The carpet was against me, its thick pile slowing my progress as I pulled myself forward on my elbows, shutting my eyes against the pain. Blood trickled from the wound in my head, through my hair and down my forehead. I wiped it from my eyes and licked it from my lips and tried not to be too concerned when it kept coming. They'd have to replace the carpet. The random thought brought me to a halt, and I lowered myself to the floor once again, my forehead sinking into the soft pile. What did it say about me that I was lying inches away from my dead husband, with an injury that might prove fatal? And my first thought was for the state of the carpet. How terribly banal I was. My eyes were heavy. According to all those crime series and documentaries I'd watched, it was a bad sign when someone became sleepy after a head injury. A bad sign. But I couldn't help it. Maybe, after all, it was better this way. Maybe this was a better end than the one I'd planned. Maybe. When the next blow came, it was almost a relief. Chapter 2. 8 weeks earlier. I swear I didn't know. Well, now you do. Every detail of what I went through because of you. So you know how much you owe me, don't you? I don't. Anger made the word vibrate. Don't you dare insult me by making excuses. This is the only thing I'm ever going to ask of you. Do it, then you'll never hear from me again. Right. A loud sigh followed. It's not going to be easy. No, but you'll do it, yes? Yes, I will. Another sigh, longer, filled with guilt and regret. I owe you. Chapter 3. Fiona. Fiona Carlton swirled her gin and tonic, making the ice cubes tinkle and the slice of lemon fight to stay afloat. Never wanted to be that girl, she said, staring into the glass. Sounds like a line from a song, her friend Jocelyn said. It is. Well, the title of a song, to be accurate. A Carly Pearce one. It could have been written about me. So much so that Fiona had played the song on repeat when she discovered the man she was seeing, a man she was already falling in love with, was married. It didn't matter that she'd always known. Perhaps not from their first encounter, but certainly from that first evening. Never wanted to be that girl. The other woman. She'd thought she was so clever, that she could always spot those married men who were looking for a bit of fun. Sometimes it was blindingly obvious. The indent on the ring finger, where a wedding band normally sat, a certain reticence in sharing details, a caginess about where they lived. So many giveaways. Perhaps if she'd met Rich in the usual way, in one of the wine bars she frequented, or through one of the many dating apps she'd tried when her friends told her she had to join the 21st century. They'd insisted it was the only way, the modern way, and totally acceptable. But she hadn't met him that way. She'd met him by accident. Literally. She'd been rushing to meet with a client, later than she'd hoped, and was desperately trying to read her notes as she speed-walked along the street. Her head down as she rounded the corner, she'd crashed straight into a man coming the opposite direction. With a cry of alarm, her carefully collated notes had flown one direction and she went the other. A nearby wall had saved her from falling to the pavement. She'd hit it with a grunt, immediately bending to scrabble around her feet for the pages that had come unstuck and were in danger of being swept away. Unfortunately, she'd leant down at the same time as the man she'd walked into, and they'd knocked heads. Ouch! Fuck! She'd straightened and put a hand to her forehead. "I'm so sorry," he said, bending again to collect her paperwork and hand it to her. "It was getting a bit Laurel and Hardy there, wasn't it?" She'd have said Fawlty Towers herself, but maybe it was an age thing. She took the folder he'd handed her, shuffled the pages back inside the cover, and hoped she'd have time to get them in order before her appointment. "I think you have it all," he said, bringing her eyes to him. She was good at assessing people quickly. A smart coat over a sharp suit, crisp white shirt, elegant tie, silk, she guessed, dark hair, greying at the temples. Distinguished was the word she'd have used if she'd been asked to describe him. She'd have said handsome, too, and as she noticed the twinkle in the grey eyes, she added, sexy. "Yes," she said. He smiled then. Not just a polite upward tilt of his lips, but a full, teeth-baring, face-splitting smile. "Yes, you'll have a drink with me?" Colour crept over her cheeks. She considered herself immune to every chat-up line she'd ever heard, and she'd heard many. But there was something about this man. She didn't believe in love at first sight, but lust, that was a different matter, and she was old enough, wise enough, to acknowledge exactly what it was that had flared between them. Unadulterated lust. "That's not possible." He held the smile, tilting his head a little. "Because you can't, or because you don't want to?" "Because you're way too sure of yourself. Because you might just as well have dangerous tattooed across your forehead. Because I'm old enough to know better." "I have an appointment." She tilted her wrist to check the gold watch that circled it. "In 5 minutes, to be exact." "And after?" He was persistent, with no dimming of his smile or in the pronounced twinkle in his eyes. She glanced at his left hand. He was wearing gloves, so she couldn't check to see if he was wearing a ring. "A coffee or a glass of wine? I'll leave the choice to you." His smile faded, the light in his eyes dimming a little as he waited for her reply. "To make up for almost knocking you over." Almost knocking her over, weakening her defences, making her say, "Yes, okay, a glass of wine would be nice," when she really should have laughed, shaken her head and moved on. His smile returned, full on. He pointed to the street ahead. "Do you know Dexter's?" It was a wine bar she knew well. Lots of polished wood, small, comfortable booths, flattering lighting. It was a perfect assignation spot, and she instantly had a change of heart. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. There was no maybe about it. It was a very bad idea. This kind of man, so confident in his skin, so damn sexy, brimming with charisma. He was the type of man she should run from. She was definitely old enough to know better, but also, stupidly, old enough to think she could handle this. Later, she'd wonder if that had been her first mistake. He reached out, tapped her arm gently with a hand. It's just a glass of wine. Don't overthink it. He was right. Of course he was. It was just a glass of wine. A welcome drink after what had been one of those days when anything that could possibly have gone wrong had done. She made one last attempt to put him off, one more attempt to save herself. I won't be free for at least an hour. An hour? He flicked the cuff of his shirt back and frowned at his watch. Actually, that works perfectly. The smile returned. Dexter's in an hour. I'll be waiting. He was gone before Fiona could change her mind, because she was about to. She shook her head, glanced quickly at the contents of the folder she'd dropped, reshuffled some pages, then resumed her journey. She'd get through this meeting, then catch a taxi home, have a bath, get cosy, have a glass of wine and watch something mindless on TV. That was what she'd do. It was what she should have done. Instead, she'd gone to Dexter's. When she went inside, he was there, sitting on a stool, his eyes fixed on the door, a smile spreading when he saw her. He got to his feet and walked towards her, closing in to kiss her on both cheeks, as naturally as if they'd known each other for a long time. She caught the scent of him, clean, earthy, masculine, and felt a jolt of desire. She had enough self-awareness to recognize the sensation for what it was. Nothing wrong with it. She was 38, in the full of her health. Desire was a natural reaction to a handsome, sexy man. It was what you did with the sensation that mattered. And she wasn't planning on doing anything. She thought back to that first encounter and swirled the ice cubes around in her glass again as she felt Jocelyn's eyes on her. There'd be sympathy in them, perhaps even pity. They'd been friends for a long time, had shared tears over disastrous relationships, men who had broken Fiona's heart, women who had broken Jocelyn's. Fiona stopped playing with her drink and swallowed half in a couple of mouthfuls. It was just supposed to be a glass of wine. His apology for almost knocking me over. One drink had led to another, and another. He laughing that they should have bought a bottle. She wondering where her willpower had parked itself. Dexter's did food, but nothing either of them fancied, so he suggested they go to a restaurant he knew. It's not far. We could walk, he'd said. It's Friday night. We won't get a table. Of course we will, he'd said, with a certainty she quickly came to understand was the way he approached everything. As if the world wouldn't dare to let him down. A part of her wanted him to be proved wrong, for them to be turned away when they walked through the door of a very upmarket restaurant. But not only were they offered a table, but the maitre d' had greeted him by name, and with a deferential manner that only came from knowledge. And from money. More wine, excellent food, stimulating conversation. By the time his expression took on a serious slant, when he'd stared into his wineglass and said, "There's something I should tell you," it was already too late. None so blind as those who don't want to see, and she hadn't wanted to. The instant attraction she'd felt when they'd literally bumped into each other, the jolt of desire when she'd walked into Dexter's, they were nothing to what she felt now. Not love, she wasn't that naive. More a powerful attraction that grabbed her and knocked sense out of the window. Live in the moment, she told herself, as she held a hand up to stop whatever it was he was going to say. Anyway, he didn't need to say anything. He hadn't been wearing his gloves in Dexter's. She'd seen the truth. Why don't we keep it simple? It's just tonight, a lovely evening, no strings, no promises. She'd meant it. She didn't need complications, and she'd known from their first encounter, from the way he'd looked at her with such intensity, as if he was looking at her soul, that this man had them in spades. "He should have told you he was married before it went any further," Jocelyn said. "He tried to. That first night, he'd said there was something he wanted to tell me, and I stopped him, so you can't blame him. It didn't matter anyway. By then, I'd seen his wedding ring. I knew he was married." Jocelyn sniffed. "He didn't strike me as a man who could be stopped from doing anything he wanted to do." "You only met him once." At an exhibition in the art gallery Jocelyn's wife owned. It had been Rich and Fiona's third date. They hadn't slept together as yet, and that was going to be the night they did. Both knew it, and she supposed they'd made it clear with their constant touching, the knowing smiles, the sexual chemistry that could have powered the rather overwhelming lighting that the artist had insisted on using for his exhibition. They'd moved from one gigantic painting to the next, from the overlit areas to the darker corners where they'd kissed, where his hands had shimmied over the slip dress she'd worn. The heat of his fingers had seared her skin, making her forget herself, forget where they were. She remembered Jocelyn had been less than impressed, shooting them quelling looks that only made Fiona giggle and Rich shrug his shoulders before pulling her into a clinch. "Once was enough," Jocelyn said. "Honestly, you behaved abominably, as if all the filters of normal behaviour had been wiped away. I still think you were both high on something." She held a hand up quickly. "And please don't say you were high on each other unless you want me to puke." "I wasn't going to say that." Embarrassingly, Fiona was about to say just that, because it was exactly how she'd felt. After dinner that first night, they'd gone for a walk along the Thames, holding hands, lost in conversation, deaf and blind to the traffic. By the end, before he'd left her at the door of her apartment block, she knew 3 things. That he was married, that she didn't care, and, for the first time, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could have it all. Chapter 4. Fiona. Fiona wasn't lying to her friend, or to herself either. She had never wanted to be that girl, and she hated herself for being in a situation she'd always sworn to avoid. The problem was that she loved Rich more. Jocelyn lifted a hand to catch the bartender's attention. Once she had it, she lifted her glass, waggled it, and held up 2 fingers. "So, what are you going to do?" she said, bringing her attention back to Fiona. "Do?" As if it was that simple. As if she could do something to make everything okay. Wave a magic wand. Cast a spell. Turn back the clock to the day she'd met Rich. Choose a different path to travel to that meeting. Leave the office a minute earlier, a minute later. Avoid that twist of fate that had her bump into him. "I'm not sure." 2 fresh drinks arrived on the bar before them. Jocelyn emptied the last of her drink into the new one. Lifting the brimming glass carefully, she took a sip. "I suppose it's only been 2 months," she said, putting the glass down. Fiona resisted using the perennial cry of the misunderstood, the childish, "you don't understand." She was a mature, intelligent, university-educated, successful woman. And Jocelyn was right. It had only been 2 months. But she was also wrong. There were no shades of grey in Jocelyn's world. She saw things in uncomplicated black and white. Perhaps because for her, things always had been. She'd started working in the gallery when she finished an arts degree in university. 10 years later, she and the gallery owner married on a beach in Mexico. Fiona wasn't sure if everything worked out for Jocelyn because she was so black and white, or because she was so black and white, everything worked out for her. It was the old chicken and egg conundrum. She was wrong to think that 2 months was too short a time to change someone's life. How could a woman who'd married the first person she'd fallen crazily in love with, and to whom she was still happily married after all these years, possibly understand Fiona's situation? Especially as she wasn't sure she completely understood it herself. Since that first evening, a day hadn't gone by that she didn't speak to Rich. Not just messages. Proper, old-fashioned phone calls squeezed into minutes between rushing from appointment to appointment, phone pressed to her ear as she hurried along the street. She'd speak to him in a hushed voice while sitting on the toilet, giggling like a schoolchild when she told him where she was. They chatted on the tube, in a taxi, anywhere, everywhere. It quickly became an addiction, an obsession. She simply couldn't get enough of him. Normally careful, fully focused on her career, wise to men and their shenanigans, she sometimes felt as if he'd cast a spell over her, bewitched her. Feeling Jocelyn's eyes on her, she huffed a laugh and picked up her drink. "Seriously," Jocelyn said quietly, "I think you need to forget about this guy." Again with the stupid advice, making everything seem so fucking simple. It was so damn easy for her. She had it all. A successful business, a woman who loved her. Was it wrong that Fiona was just a tiny bit envious of what her friend had and wanted it for herself? Maybe Rich had cast a spell over her, because despite being married, he struck her as being perfect. "I can't forget about him. It's not so easy to detach myself from my emotions." It was Jocelyn's turn to huff a laugh, and she did so loudly, shaking her head as if it was the funniest thing she'd heard. "Come on, Fiona. You're not an 18-year-old filled with hormones and angst. You're 38, supposedly sophisticated, worldly wise. You're a kick-ass businesswoman, with more balls than most men I know, so of course you can. What you need is more introspection. Socrates says—" Fiona chopped a hand in the air between them, startling her friend into silence. Jocelyn's expression quickly changed from supportive to aggrieved. It put Fiona on the back foot, making her once more the guilty party. "I'm sorry," she said. And she was. She didn't mean to offend her friend, but God almighty, every bloody time she had a problem, Jocelyn came out with the same blasted quotation. "The unexamined life is not worth living." Fiona wasn't sure if it simply happened to fit whatever predicament she'd found herself in, or whether it was the only quotation Jocelyn knew. Did she think that quoting Socrates made her sound profound? It would take a lot more than that to make the rather superficial woman approach any level of profundity. Fiona sighed as the bitchy thought sizzled through her head. Her friend deserved better. "I really am sorry, and you're right. I need to put Rich from my head and my life." Luckily, although Jocelyn was easily offended, she was also easily appeased, and Fiona's apology resulted in almost immediate relaxation in the tension between them. Before more advice she'd no intention of following was offered, Fiona hurried to change the subject. "Enough about my love life. Tell me about this next exhibition you're arranging." It was the perfect distraction. Jocelyn was always more than happy to have the conversation turned towards her beloved gallery. Her enthusiasm was both entertaining and infectious, and usually Fiona, who was genuinely interested in the workings of the gallery, was happy to listen. And she did, for a few minutes, until her thoughts drifted back to Rich and when she was going to see him again. "On the 15th, do you think you'll be free to come?" Fiona tuned back in. She assumed Jocelyn was still speaking about the upcoming exhibition and nodded emphatically. "I wouldn't miss it." "Brilliant. I wasn't sure it'd be your thing, although it's such a good cause, isn't it?" A good cause? Maybe she hadn't been talking about the exhibition at all. Shit. What had Fiona just agreed to? Yes, it is. An excellent cause. Fancy dress is optional, of course, but I think most people will get into the spirit of the thing since it's so close to Christmas." Close to Christmas? So the 15th of December, not November. But double shit. fancy fucking dress. She'd have to confess and tell Jocelyn that she hadn't been listening. While she was being honest, perhaps she should confess that she'd no intention of putting Rich out of her head or her life, that she was consumed by him. Jocelyn would raise her eyebrows, shake her head, and she might even try to quote Socrates again. No, perhaps confessing wasn't a good idea. It was a better option to try to prise the information from her without having to admit she hadn't been listening. What are you and Kate planning to go as? That drew a devilish laugh from Jocelyn. Kate wanted us to go as Mrs. and Mrs. Claus, but I nixed that. Too twee for words. So we're going as the little drummer boy. I'm wearing a rather sexy little military-style suit, and Kate is... going dressed as a drum? Fiona couldn't help it. She laughed. I don't know how she puts up with you. So you are going to look fab, and she's going to be sweltering inside some big drum costume. I did say that I'd wear the drum costume, but she insisted she wanted to, so what's a girl to do? They had been married 10 years, and Kate was still absolutely smitten. If, sometimes, Fiona shook her head at how lovey-dovey they were, at the way Kate obviously adored Jocelyn, and if she sometimes sneered at the whole exclusiveness of their love, mostly she envied it. Now, with Rich, she didn't have to. He looked at her the way Kate looked at Jocelyn. There he was again, intruding into her thoughts. She shut him away and concentrated on the conversation. You could have gone as 2 Christmas fairies, then both of you would have looked amazing. Way too much of a cliché, Jocelyn said with a smile. You could get away with it. I'd like to see you as a fairy. Not my scene at all, my friend, but I'll think of something. Well, you'd better look into it soon. The 15th of December will be here before you can blink, and it's a busy time for costume rental companies. Plus, if you're going to stay over, you'd better book a room if the hotel isn't already booked out. Stay over? Triple shit. Why hadn't she put Rich out of her head for just a few minutes and listened to what Jocelyn had been saying? How long had Fiona been lost in her thoughts that it had gone from talk about an exhibition to whatever the hell this was? Perhaps I'd better try them now. Do you have their number to hand? Jocelyn reached for her handbag, pulled it open and rummaged inside. She pulled out her mobile, tapped for a few seconds, then handed it over. There you go. Fiona took it and read quickly. Cranford Castle is delighted to host the Art United Christmas Charity Ball. She didn't read any further. Art United. The words were flashing, neon bright, making her blink and reach up to squeeze the corners of her eyes with her thumb and first finger, careful not to smudge her eye makeup, refusing to descend to panda-eyed misery. You okay? Jocelyn's voice, full of quick sympathy. Fiona took her fingers away and blinked rapidly. New mascara. It seems to be irritating my eyes a little. It was the perfect excuse to offer the makeup-obsessed Jocelyn, who launched into a detailed monologue on the dubious ingredients some companies added to their products. Once again, Fiona wasn't listening. The Art United charity. Rich had mentioned it. She thought he might be a patron. So he was bound to be at the ball. With his wife. If she was still around. December the 15th was 6 weeks away. Anything could happen between now and then. Fiona pictured herself walking into the charity ball with Rich. They'd go as themselves. A dynamic duo. And heads would turn to look at them, and people would whisper that they were obviously so in love. She had 6 weeks. It was plenty of time for secrets to be revealed, accidents to happen, lives to change. Fiona wasn't sure what she could do, but that had never stopped her before. Chapter 5. Fiona. Fiona preferred to use the word focused rather than obsessed, which had such negative connotations. Jocelyn would say she was fooling herself. Perhaps she was. There was probably a host of articles written about where the line was between focus and obsession, but she wasn't going to give them any coinage by looking them up. Actually, determined was probably the better word to use. She liked to think it defined her completely. When she saw something she wanted, she went for it. Her role as investment consultant with one of the biggest London firms was one she'd fought for, working ridiculously long hours to prove herself, knowing that even now in the 21st century, a woman had to be twice, even 3 times better than a man to have a chance at winning. Through those years when work was her priority, love was always an afterthought. Lust was easily satisfied. Like everything else, when she saw a man she wanted, she went for it. Satisfying sex, no strings, no distraction. And then Rich had come along, found a crack in her armour, and wriggled his way in. She could have pushed him out again, of course, and she might have done if he hadn't quickly, unexpectedly, become part of her. Now she had a choice. Give Rich up, or claim him for herself. She'd booked a hotel room for that charity function. Rich would be at it, whether or not his wife was at his side. Fiona had 6 weeks to try to organise it to be not. Booking the room was the easy step. She wasn't entirely sure what the other steps to her goal would be. If she was being completely honest, she wasn't even 100% sure what that goal was. Marriage? Did she really want that? She wasn't sure, but she was sure she didn't want Rich married to someone else. Without a clear idea of what to do, she decided being armed with knowledge would be a good first step. To learn everything she could about this woman she wanted to be rid of. So much of her work took place out of the office, whether it was visiting clients in their homes or places of business, or occasionally working from home. It left her free to do some investigating. She refused to use the word stalking, although it popped into her head. Contrary to what her friend imagined, Fiona did examine her life and her thoughts. Examined, then ignored what she didn't like. Rich and his wife. Fiona knew her name but refused to use it, as if personalising her made her more real, more human. She recognised it for what it was. Guilt. Because she had never wanted to be the type of woman who'd happily steal another woman's man. How naive she'd been. It wasn't something she'd actively done. It was something that had crept over her against her will at that first meeting with Rich. It had imprisoned her, made her behave totally out of character. That's why she was there, in her car, parked at the curb opposite the house Rich and his wife shared. She'd no idea what the wife's routine was, whether she left the house every morning to go to work, a gym, or to meet friends for coffee. It was hardly the kind of thing she could ask Rich. After his initial attempt to tell Fiona about his wife, he'd never referred to her or mentioned her name. He hadn't said where they lived either, but that was easy for Fiona to find out. Like her, he worked in finance, and there was always someone who knew someone who had the answers she needed. She peered through the car window and reluctantly admired the large, detached home. What would be described in estate agent speak as a fine family residence. She knew Rich had 2 children, thankfully grown up and living elsewhere. If she'd been interested, she could have discovered where, but finding out they didn't live at home was sufficient for her needs. There were no children to keep Rich tied to a wife he didn't love, in a marriage he'd outgrown. Of course, he hadn't admitted to either, but Fiona saw how his eyes lit up when she arrived, the way his shoulders relaxed, the lines of tension on his face ease. He was happy with her. He wanted to be with her. From where she sat, Fiona could see through the wide gateway and up the short drive to the front door. She'd searched for photographs of the wife, but she obviously wasn't keen on the public gaze, of the many events Rich had to attend, and all the photographs of him. There were none of her. Surprisingly, she had little social media presence either. That or she kept her privacy levels high. Fiona, who posted on social media at least daily, was surprised that anyone could stay under the radar in the 21st century. Her desire to see what the competition looked like was reaching desperation level. It was almost tempting to go across and ring the doorbell with some made-up excuse. She would have done too, except there was always the chance that the wife knew about her husband's affair. Since Fiona had a huge social media presence, if the wife had any curiosity about her, she'd recognise her immediately. Fiona imagined the scene and shuddered at the image of face-slapping and name-calling that sprung to mind. Luckily, she could work from the car, so the time wasn't completely wasted. She opened her laptop and answered a few emails. At the end of every sentence, her eyes flicked upward and she stared at the door. Then she went back to her emails. It wasn't until nearly 11, 2 hours after she'd arrived, that the front door opened and a woman appeared. The laptop was dropped quickly onto the passenger seat as Fiona scrabbled for her mobile. The gods were looking out for her because instead of jumping into the snazzy BMW parked in the driveway, the wife left the house on foot. She walked past Fiona on the other side of the road and strolled along without a care in the world. Fiona caught it all on video. When the wife was gone from view, she replayed it, slowly, stopping now and then to zoom in for a closer look. She was a dyed blonde. No criticism there, so was Fiona. But unlike Fiona, the wife was showing signs of her age, with sagging jowls and thinning hair. She'd probably chosen the unflattering baggy jacket to hide curves that had become far too curvaceous. A bad choice. All it had done was to emphasise her size. And the colour. Fiona wondered with a snigger if the wife was perhaps colourblind. Comparisons were always unfair to someone, and usually Fiona didn't stoop to making them. There was always going to be someone more successful, more beautiful, slimmer, richer. But she was only human, and in the comparison stakes with Rich's wife, Fiona knew she won hands down. It should have made her feel better. But it didn't. Because this was the woman Rich was choosing to stay with. The one he went home to after spending hours with Fiona. Hours where they'd had dinner, drinks, walked hand in hand back to her apartment, and had wild and incredibly satisfying sex. She watched the video again and again. Each time, the viewing irritated her more. This overweight woman, going to seed, was holding on to the man Fiona wanted. She hadn't become a successful businesswoman by waiting for things to happen. She'd learnt that if you wanted something, if you wanted it bad enough, you went after it and got it. And nothing or nobody got in her way. Chapter 6. Lydia. I wasn't sure when things started to change. "It's empty nest syndrome," my friend Alice said, nodding as if she knew the answers to all the world's problems. Or perhaps she'd found them at the end of what was her third, or was it her fourth, drink. She wasn't right. The twins had left home several years before when they'd chosen to go to university in Edinburgh rather than London. They'd come home for holidays and for a couple of months between jobs, but I knew they'd never live at home again. It didn't make me sad. I'd brought both up to have the confidence to cut the family strings and make their own way in the world. Granted, I didn't expect them to go quite so far, but when Missy went to work in Sydney 3 years earlier, I knew it was only a matter of time before her brother followed her trail. When he did, Rich and I went to visit, and we fell in love with Sydney as the twins had done. For a short time, we'd considered moving there too, but for one reason or another, nothing had come of that idea. I might envy my children with their supreme self-confidence, their belief that the world was theirs for the taking. I might even miss them at times. But it wasn't their absence that had caused my life to shift ever so slightly off its axis. Not enough to make me completely miserable, but enough to make the weight of every day just that much more difficult to bear. "Perhaps you're right," I said to Alice, because I was suddenly sorry I'd brought it up. The couple of drinks had made me unusually unguarded, enough to ask my friend if she ever felt that life had suddenly taken a wrong turn. Perhaps if we'd been closer friends, I might have admitted the truth, that it was my relationship with Rich that seemed to have changed. Back in university, there had been friends I would have opened my heart to, friends to whom I'd have told everything. We'd lost touch over the years, and it seemed I'd also lost the ability to make friends like that. No, that wasn't quite true. I hadn't made new friends because I hadn't needed them. I had Rich. Our relationship was so good, so close, that I could tell him everything, anything. I'm not sure when that stopped. When I noticed his eyes glaze over as I spoke, his non-committal replies, the lack of genuine, or any kind, of interest in what I was saying. When had he started to find me pathetic rather than amusing? I'd seen the extra lines that had appeared almost overnight on my face, and the slight sagging along my jawline, and the thickening of my waist, no matter what damn diet I tried, no matter how many bloody repetitions of whatever new faddy exercise that shouted itself to be the one that would make the difference. Was that the simple, sad answer? That I was getting old and he no longer found me attractive, entertaining, fanciable? God, had we sunk to that awful cliché? Had he found someone else, someone younger, more vibrant? Or after 40 years, had he finally decided he wanted to see what else was out there? We, or maybe it was just I, had prided myself on the fact I'd only ever slept with one man. Rich used to be able to say he'd only ever slept with me. Would he be able to say that now? Or had he stopped being able to say that a long time ago? Maybe I was fooling myself, seeing life as I wanted it to be, not as it was. Life as it was. When had it become so dull? Was that it? Had Rich gone looking for excitement and found it with another woman? I pictured him in his smart suits, the crisp white shirts I ironed, the silk ties I chose, the grey at his temples only adding to his good looks. A silver fox. Is that what they'd call him? I'd seen women at those ghastly functions we used to attend, giving him the once-over. Glamorous, attractive, charming, exciting women. Exciting women with dynamic lives and high-powered jobs. I had thought about going back to work when the children were old enough, but somehow there was always some family emergency that stopped me. By the time they went to university, and I'd seriously thought about getting back into the workforce, my basic computer skills excluded me from anything I wanted to do. Instead, I took a volunteer job at a local charity shop for 2 afternoons a week. I thought it'd give me something to talk about, but I can't remember the last time Rich and I had talked about anything. If he'd gone looking for excitement, if he was having an affair. So I thought we'd go as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. What do you think? Since I was at that precise moment imagining Rich in a tryst with some slim, gorgeous woman, the arrival of the rotund twins into the conversation came as a surprise, and it took a few seconds for my brain to catch up with the conversation. It wasn't difficult. Since we'd decided to go to it the previous month, Alice had brought up the Art United fancy dress charity ball every time we'd met. It was still 6 weeks away, so I suppose I'd better get used to it being a continuous topic of conversation. So what did I think? I'd met Alice's husband, Trevor, a number of times over the years. Like her, he was a small man, but unlike her, who had managed to remain somewhat slim, he was almost as round as he was tall. He also had incredibly thin legs.